tracking developments in the trial of 3 Tacoma police officers in the death of Manuel Ellis. Thanks for joining us. I'm Christine Pay. Ellis died while being restrained by police in March of 2020. Officers Matthew Collins, Christopher Burbank, and Timothy Rankin are all facing charges in his death. King 5 is live streaming the entire trial from opening to closing statements. We take you now to the courtroom live.
Welcome back, Mr. Hayes. We'll have the jury out here in just a moment. I said, welcome back, Mr. Hayes. We'll have the jury here in just a minute. And then we'll resume.
Beautiful.
Nice day.
Yes. What? Okay.
We can't hear. I'm turning it back on. Thank you.
Okay, welcome back, everybody. Please be seated. Okay, Mr. Brunner, you may resume when you're ready.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Mr. Hayes.
Good afternoon.
All right.
Yeah.
How long did the whole incident last from when you first came out and saw Mr. Ellis with the officers struggling until it looked like he was subdued?
When I went back inside, at that time, I didn't know if it was totally subdued or not, because when the backup showed up, I wasn't outside much long after that, after the first backup showed up, but I went back in the house.
So when the first backup showed up, was that 2 officers that you saw?
I saw the car, and I don't remember if there was 2. I know there was 1 for sure, but I saw the 1 guy on the driver's side. I don't remember if there was 1 guy on the passenger side.
And did the car arrive pretty quickly?
Yeah, it was a Tacoma PD car, a white one.
And from the time that they arrived until the time you went inside, how long about do you think that was?
Just a couple of minutes,
Okay.
at most.
Did you see anything during the whole time you observed the officers with Mr. Ellis that concerned you?
Question, Your Honor. Relevance.
Well, it's relevant, but I suppose it's so broad, it's hard to know exactly what you're getting at. Could you hone that down a little bit?
I will, Your Honor, thank you.
I mean, he's already indicated some concern about traffic,
Yeah, definitely you were definitely concerned about the traffic,
but I don't
right?
know if you have any other, if you mean something else by that.
Did you see the officers do anything that caused you concern?
No, I didn't see any kicking or choking or punching or anything like that.
And in terms of what the officers said, you heard things like comply?
It was either comply, I can't remember if it was comply or stop resisting. I know they said something to him when they were trying to subdue him.
Like comply or stop resisting, or both?
It might have been, like I said, it's been 3 years, so I'm trying to remember everything, so.
Completely understood. And as far as what you heard Mr. Ellis say, did you hear him say anything?
I didn't, he might have made some sounds and stuff, but I didn't hear any words that were clear to me.
Did you ever hear him say something like, try that again?
Uh-uh.
You were interviewed by the Attorney General's office about a year after the incident. Does
Okay.
that sound right?
Yeah, I think so. I don't remember the exact date.
And that was by, including one of the lawyers, Miss Eakes, who's sitting here at council table. Do you recognize her?
No,
all
I'm
right.
sorry.
I'm sure she won't be offended, but
I'm sorry. I
you
don't.
were interviewed by the AGs.
Okay.
Were you ever subpoenaed or asked to testify on behalf of the state in this trial?
No. Not that I know of. I mean, I got a subpoena letter, but I think it was from you guys.
From us, from the defense. Okay, thank you, sir. That's all I have.
Okay.
Your Honor, I have no further questions. Anything, Your Honor.
Okay, Mr. Hayes, you're excused. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Your Honor, Paul Kennett, why is this here? Before I respond here to the judge, raise your right hand and we'll sit here.
Yeah, yes, sir. Please come forward right about here. Please raise your hand to be signed. Be sworn. So we swear or affirm that your testimony in this cause will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Thank you very much. I have a seat right here. Please state your name and please spell your name.
My name is Kennett Chance Leeton Ashford White.
Let's go to first and last name, please.
First name is Kennett, last name is Ashford White.
Can you spell that?
Kennett. Ashford is ASHFORD -WHITE.
Thank you. Mr. Bircher.
Thank you. Sir, good afternoon. What's your current address?
701 115th, apartment number 3.
Okay,
Tacoma.
who do you live there with?
My wife,
And where did you live before that?
1438 96th Street,
And
Tacoma,
then
Washington.
that's close to the corner of Ainsworth and
Ainsworth,
796.
yes.
All right. And did you live there back in March of 2020?
Yes.
Who all lived there at the house at that point in time?
My parents, my sister and her now husband, and her children, and me and my wife,
Okay.
ex-wife.
Your former wife. And your sister's name is what?
Her surname is Melang now, but it was White previously.
And her first name is Ayana?
Yes.
Okay, very good. And if we could put up on the overhead exhibit 151A, please. And Mr. White, if you want to come down here to the screen, and there's a pointer someplace close, right here. Actually, I don't need it, just, yeah, right there. If you could show the jury what your residence was back in March of 2020.
Be this this house waiting.
Okay, and that's the double decker of that house?
Yeah.
Right. And you said that there was 3 different families living there, your parents, your sister, and your wife?
Yes.
Right. Very good. And if you could go ahead and give us the exhibit number 533N. Okay, sir, and is this the front of the home?
Yes.
And where did you and your wife live, or where did you stay during that period of time back in March 2001?
Previously, I resided up in the room across right here.
Okay, and there's a air conditioning unit that's in there.
Yes.
All right. What, if any, effect does that have on us being able to see out the window?
Not at all. The floor and the roof is probably the same height as me, just 3 inches higher. So
Okay.
I can see over it, no problem.
All right, very good. Or you can retake your seat. You can take out the exhibit. Sir, on March 3rd of 2020, were you there late that evening?
Yes.
And what, if anything, were you doing that night?
That night I was just playing around on my phone.
Okay. And did anything catch your attention towards the latter part of the evening?
I had heard a person screaming outside, so I had got up and walked to the window to see what was happening.
Okay. And what, if anything, did you see out the window?
I could see the cop car lights and the front end of the cop car.
Okay. Did you see any people?
Not at that point.
All right. And when you looked out, you were looking out which window of your house?
The window that was on the top floor.
All right. For the
That's
air
the bedroom.
conditioning?
Yes.
And so after looking out the window, what did you do next?
After that, I looked at my cell phone to see if I could see what was going on, and then I had gone downstairs because the system that connects the security cam to our phone was not working at that time.
In the system, is that the Vivint system?
Yes, Vivint.
Vivint system? And did you look at the Vivint system itself to see what it is?
I went to the house's main display, which was working.
Okay. And what did you see on the Vivint system when you looked at it?
From the point that it had activated, I had saw where the brown sedan and then the police officer, and then there was another car where the lady had started to scream.
Sorry. Your Honor, I have a hard time hearing this. Hold the microphone closer to you.
Thank you.
Sir. What's good? Stand again. What did you see?
On the security system, I had saw previously that there was a sedan and a police officer's car right there, and then the lady that was screaming at the police officer.
Okay. Did you see anybody outside the 3 vehicles?
Potentially, my neighbor was out on the sidewalk or around outside their house.
Okay. Did you see any police officers or anybody else in the vehicle?
Not until I got down and physically went to the door.
Okay. And you said went down, or went downstairs of the home there?
Yeah, the first floor.
Did you go outside?
At that point, I hadn't gone outside. I just pushed the curtain on the door open.
And what did you see?
The cops and the car right there.
I'm sorry?
The cops, the vehicle, and the 2 other vehicles.
Okay. And did you then go outside?
Yes.
And what did you see when you went outside?
At that point, I could see the police officers trying to restrain the man.
Okay. And describe, if you will, to the jury, what exactly that you saw the officers trying to do.
From that point, I was able to see that the police officers were trying to restrain him. They had got him at least down to the ground, and he was resisting the police officers trying to arrest him.
Okay. And we said that the officers got him down to the ground. How were the officers situated?
The closest police officer to me was still right in front of the vehicle, and then the other police officer was on top of the person.
Okay. And what was the individual that they were associated with? What was he doing? Was he just lying there? Was he struggling?
Resisting, so looked like at some point the police officer had been pushed up by the person, and they'd been trying to get him under control to get the handcuffs on him.
Okay. How long did you watch these 3 individuals in this situation?
Off and on for about 30-40 minutes.
Okay, and then over that period of time, kind of take us through what it is that you saw.
Once I had seen what they had done, I got him down to the ground and we're trying to get him under control, put the handcuffs on him.
Okay.
I had sat out on the front porch for a little while with my brother-in-law and then gone back in. There had been some points where he had said that he couldn't breathe and that the police officers were telling him to stop resisting.
Okay. And did you see them actually, the officers handcuff this individual?
I could not see the handcuffs from the angle that I was at.
Okay. You said that you heard the officer say not to resist.
Yes. Yes.
And you heard the individual say he couldn't breathe.
Yes.
All right. Did you see any people come and respond to the officers while they were there?
Several other squad cars had ended up coming to the scene. The first one that arrived had pretty much parked their vehicle in the middle of the street in front of my parents' house, and then the rest of them came from all over, coming down 96th Street in Ainsworth.
Okay. When you're watching the officers struggling with this individual, was there anything unusual about what you perceived about the strength of the person trying to attack him?
Just being able to kind of push a police officer off of him is a little strong. I was in the prior service, and knowing that the Marine Corps SAPI plate or body armor is about an extra 25 to 50 pounds depending on the person. I know it takes a little bit of strength to be able to get someone to move off of you with that on.
Okay. And you saw that the individual was underneath the officer trying to be able to move the officer to put that
Yes.
square. All right. And then after the other officers responded, did you see anything else that happened to the individual that was first being detained?
At some point they had started doing CPR, and then the EMT had came from the fire department and did CPR themselves.
Okay. With respect to the officers, the manner in which they were dealing with the individual on the ground, was there anything unusual about the amount of force that they were using?
I'm gonna object.
Let me ask this, Abby. Did you see any strikes from the officers to the individual on the ground?
From the point that I had started to be able to see, there was nothing that I saw that the officers did
Okay.
with impact of striking or kicking or anything.
What about the individual on the ground? Did you see him striking the officer?
No, I did not.
Okay, just they were struggling to stay under arrest. And with respect to the actual struggle itself between the two officers and the individual, how long do you recall that last?
Probably 5-10 minutes.
Okay, and then you saw the other folks respond.
Yes.
Did you hear the sound of a taser being applied?
I heard between 3 and 4 tasers being deployed.
And you heard it, did you actually see it being applied?
No, I did not.
With respect to how you were able to observe the scene, did you have a clear view of the officers, or was there anything in the way that...
The front of their vehicle was obscuring a portion of each officer
Okay. Where were the officers in relation to the front of the vehicle?
within 3 to 4 feet of the front of the vehicle.
They were in front of the vehicle.
Yes.
That would be in the roadway.
Yes.
When, after, you were there until the event apparently ended?
For most of the part, once the EMT and all it came over and took care.
Were you contacted by law enforcement later that day or the next Monday morning?
We had a police officer show up and request if we had any video or weight that was recording the situation.
All right, and did you provide that to him?
We gave him the ability to look at the system itself, but at that point we had no ability to pass it over. It was given to both the police and the victim's family.
Okay, and with respect to what was on the Vivid video, what you showed to the police officer was the scene that you'd seen earlier that evening?
Yes.
All right. great. Mr. White, that's all I have. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Ms. Eads?
Good afternoon, Mr. White.
Hello.
My name is Patty. I'm one of the prosecutors. Just want to ask you a few follow-up questions, okay?
Okay.
Can you tell me, first of all, do you recall that you gave a statement to the Pierce County Sheriff's Department on June 8th, 2020?
Yes.
Okay. And that was the first time that anyone from law enforcement had come and spoken to you about this incident?
After the event, yes.
After the initial night?
Yes.
All right. And would you agree that your memory about what happened back in 2020 was better than it is today?
It would be way more clear, yes.
Okay. And did you have an opportunity to review the statement that you gave to the sheriff's office?
Yes.
That was provided to you by Mr. Bone, the investigator for the defense? Is that
Yes.
right? Okay. All right. So I just want to go back and make sure I understand what you saw. First of all, you were playing video games that night up in the attic, is that right?
Yes.
And I think you said that you first became aware that something was going on outside when you heard a woman screaming, correct?
Yes.
You didn't hear anything before the screaming of the woman, correct?
No, I did not.
And she was yelling, don't punch or don't punch him, just arrest him.
Yes.
And you could hear that from upstairs, correct?
Yes.
And you recall that you then looked out the window and you could see, despite the air conditioning unit, you could see outside, correct?
Yes.
And that's when you saw the police cruiser,
Yes.
and then you saw a car parked behind the police cruiser, right?
I could see that through the camera itself.
Okay. Were you looking at that on your phone?
No, when I went downstairs,
Okay, so when you were upstairs, you couldn't see the car behind the police cruiser?
there is no way to see the vehicle behind the police cruiser.
All right. And then you couldn't, and eventually you saw a second car behind the woman who was screaming, correct?
Yes.
And could you not see that from your upstairs window?
No.
And you also couldn't see what was happening if there was the officers or whoever the man was that they were struggling with from upstairs, correct?
I could not see that.
Do you recall saying to the Pierce County Sheriff's Office that you could hear the man in the car behind the woman saying, just go around,
Yes.
but you couldn't hear anything that the officers were saying, if they were saying anything, correct?
No, I did not.
And you couldn't hear the person on the ground, right?
No.
And was there a telephone pole that obstructed your view, is that correct?
There is a telephone pole within the view line there, yes.
Okay, it prevented you from being able to see what was happening with the officers and the man?
Yes.
All right. And so if I understand you correctly, when you weren't able to see from upstairs, that's when you decided to go downstairs and take a look at the alarm, is that right?
Yes.
And you looked at the alarm system, and you also looked at the Vivint video, is that right?
The alarm system is the Vivint display.
It's all the same thing?
Yes.
All right. And where is that located?
Right about 15 feet from the front door.
And when you looked at it, you saw that the camera had not captured whatever had started this incident, is that right?
They had not captured the beginning of the incident.
And in fact, what you saw is that the video showed the police car already in place, and then the woman's car who had been yelling, and then the car behind her, correct?
Yes.
And you looked at that on the little panel itself, about 15 feet from the front door?
Yes.
And I think you said previously that you knew from your experience that that camera system could be a little glitchy in terms of when it would actually pick up movement. Is that fair?
Yes. We have it was originally set at a certain distance for it to activate because 96th Street is a pretty busy road, so it constantly picked up the cars driving by, and we tried to adjust it so it just showed people walking up to the door itself.
Okay. And so it was kind of inconsistent in terms of what it picked up. Is that right?
Yes.
And would you agree that when you were coming downstairs from the upstairs and looking at the Vivint, you don't know what was happening outside during that time, correct?
Not that particular time.
Because
Yes.
you couldn't look outside at all.
Yes.
And I think you said this, but I just want to make sure. You didn't see Mr. Ellis hit the officers at all, did you?
No, I did not.
And you didn't see him punch the officers?
I did not.
You didn't see him kick the officers?
I did not.
You didn't see him pick up and throw any of the officers?
Not pick up with right. No.
And you also didn't see the officers punch Mr. Ellis
I did not.
or hit him
Did not.
or kick him?
No.
After you looked at the Vivint on the wall, is that when you then went to the door and opened the curtains so that you could look outside?
Yes, I'd gone to the system, tapped it to wake it up, and then went and checked the door, and then came back to the system.
You checked the door and then you went back to the system?
Yes.
And why did you go back to the system?
It takes a little while for the system to try to go through the next menu.
Okay. Oh, I see. So you were kind of warming it up and then
Yeah.
looked, and then went back to look at the video. Is that right?
Yes.
And so how long were you away from the window during that time?
Less than a minute.
And I think you said previously that by the time that you kind of saw things from downstairs, where you could actually see the officers and Mr. Ellis was mostly just being pushed down to the ground. Is that right?
Yes.
And I think you described it in your statement to the sheriff's office as a kind of a slight altercation. You recall saying that?
Yes.
And you saw the officers, Mr. Ellis was being pushed from his knees. He was on the ground on his knees, correct?
Yes.
And he was being pushed to the ground?
Yes.
And that's the highest you ever saw Mr. Ellis. He wasn't standing up. He was on his knees or he was down on the ground, correct?
Yes.
Throughout the time that you saw him?
Yes.
And the officers, I think you said, had Mr. Ellis's arms when he was down on his knees, is that right?
They were trying to restrain him. Yes.
And they were forcing him down to the ground?
Yes.
And all of that you saw when you were downstairs, looking out the window, correct?
Yes.
And I think you said this happened right in front of the patrol car, is that right?
Yes.
About 3 to 5 feet in front of the patrol car?
Yes.
All right, I want to ask you some questions about the taser deployment, because you talked about that in your statement to the sheriff's office back in 2020, is that right?
Yes.
And I think you said a moment ago you heard the taser deployed 3 or 4 times,
Yes.
and you actually saw the taser in the hand of one of the officers, right?
I could hear it. Couldn't exactly see it.
Okay. Do you recall saying back in 2020 that you could see the taser in one of the officer's hands?
I do not recall.
Would it help to see if it refreshes your memory if I show you the statement that you gave?
That, yeah.
I'm handing you what's been marked as State's Exhibit 829. If you could take a look at that, I direct you to page 9.
I'm not.
Take a look at about 5 lines from the bottom. Where it says answer, it starts with so.
Yes.
Does that refresh your memory that you said back in June of 2020 that you actually saw the taser in one of the officer's hands?
Yes.
And I think you described the tasers as there were first 2 taser shocks, and they were pretty close together. Do you recall that?
Yes.
And then there was a third one that wasn't directly on top of the first 2. Is that correct?
There was a time between them. Yes.
There was time between them. And Mr. Ellis was on the ground when the taser was deployed.
Yes.
And after the taser was deployed, Mr. Ellis didn't attempt to kick or strike the officers in any way, did he?
No. Not that I could see.
And after you heard the third taser deployment, the officers appeared to you to get the handcuffs on Mr. Ellis. Is that right?
From what I could see, yes.
From what you could see. After Mr. Ellis was tased, I think you said that they then took Mr. Ellis and put him face down on the pavement. Is that right?
Rolled him over
Yes,
to be able
onto the stomach.
onto his back.
No, onto his stomach. Do you recall saying that?
Go ahead. Do not recall him saying rolling him onto his stomach.
Take a look at page 9.
You guys are talking on top of each other. Let him finish his statement. I didn't hear what he said.
I do not recall ever saying rolling him onto his stomach. He would have been on his stomach when they're trying to arrest him.
I'm sorry, say again.
He would have been on his stomach trying to be arrested when they were trying to arrest him.
Okay, I'm sorry. So he was already on his stomach, is what you're saying?
Yes.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure I understood that. And there was an officer that was essentially on Mr. Ellis's back. Is that right?
Yes.
And they were pressing Mr. Ellis's torso into the ground.
Restraining him. Yes.
Now, did you see one of the officers put Mr. Ellis in a chokehold
I did not.
right before the taser?
Did not see a chokehold.
Okay. And you didn't actually see the fire of the taser, you just heard it, is that right?
Yes.
Were you actually looking at that time, or were you away from the window when you heard the taser?
The tasers were deployed while I was outside on the front porch.
Okay. But you didn't see the chokehold?
I did not.
I objected to this fight. It seems kind of not evidence.
Well, it's a matter in dispute.
I can call it NLVNR. Do you know what a lateral vascular neck restraint is?
That's in dispute too. I'm not sure it makes a difference.
Did you see any type
I did not see any officer with any physical arm around his neck.
Okay. Now, after the third taser deployment, you believe that Mr. Ellis was in handcuffs, is that right?
By that point, yes.
And then I think you said that when the next arriving car, the third and the fourth officer arrived, that Mr. Ellis was then fully restrained, correct?
Yes.
And you thought that there were about 12 additional cars that arrived after that?
Yes. There was several cars that had showed up at that point.
Okay. Do you recall identifying it as 12, if you look at page 11 of your statement there? You remember saying that you saw 12 cars show up?
Like 12 squad cars that don't. Yeah. Yes.
Okay. I just want to ask you some questions about when you saw Mr. Ellis on the ground. You said he was on his stomach, correct?
Yes.
And you recall saying that you saw one officer who was to the left-hand side of Mr. Ellis?
From his head, it would have been to his right, but if you're looking down from Mr. Ellis's back, he would have been to his left side above him.
Okay. And then there was one officer who was behind Mr. Ellis, is that right?
Yes.
And you weren't able to see Mr. Ellis's arms at that point?
I was
right?
not.
And you said that I think you could only see part of his legs at that point, correct?
Part of his torso. Yes.
And part of his head?
Yes, it would have been his upper part of his body.
All right. And you recall saying that you could see Mr. Ellis's hair and stuff like that?
It was too dark to be able to see.
Do you recall saying that to the police, or if you take a look at page 8 of your statement?
No, there is no page 8 that you gave me.
Don't keep your voice
No.
There is no page 8.
Let me take a look. I can take that back. I think they're double-sided.
No.
There you go. If you look at 3 lines from the bottom, you recall saying that to the Pierce County Sheriff's Office?
I could see like his hair and stuff, yes. So the top of his body.
Okay. And do you recall seeing his hair on the top of his body?
I recall that his upper body was visible.
Okay. But you couldn't see the rest of his body, is that right?
Not below his torso.
Now, you did not take any cell phone video of this incident, did you?
I did not.
And I also want to ask you about the officer who came and spoke to you at the door. That happened after the fire department had arrived, is that right?
Yes.
And I think you said at the time that you recalled that it was one of the 2 next responding officers, correct?
Yes.
And was he a black officer?
Yes.
And he came and asked you if you'd seen anything and could tell him what happened at the beginning of the arrest. Is that right?
Yes.
And why the subject was being arrested?
He didn't ask why the subject was being arrested. He just asked if I had seen anything and what I had seen.
Okay. And you told him that the video had not caught the beginning of the incident, is that right?
Yes, told him and showed him.
And then you offered to let him look at the panel,
Yes.
and he did look at the video?
Yes.
And did you tell the officer at that time anything that you had seen?
I told him a little bit of what I had seen and that I hadn't seen the beginning.
Okay.
Didn't go into it deeply. I know that generally you'll get a report taken later on.
Okay. And somebody did come back a couple of months later to take a report, is that right?
Yes.
And you said on direct that you recall hearing Mr. Ellis say that he couldn't breathe, is that right?
Yes.
And that statement you heard was after the third and the fourth arriving officer, the first car, showed up, is that right?
After the second taser deployment.
After the second taser deployment?
Yes.
Did you recall whether it occurred after the first backup car arrived?
I could not recall.
You can't recall? Okay. And you didn't hear the officer say anything though, in response?
Not after that point.
Why don't you take a look at your statement at page 13 and see if that refreshes your memory about when you heard that statement of "I can't breathe" relative to the backup car. And you take a look at the 3 lines up from the bottom on page 13.
Okay.
Does that refresh your memory as to whether or not, when you heard Mr. Ellis say, "I can't breathe," the third and fourth, the next arriving car?
The next arriving cars had said it while they were arriving around that time.
Okay, and that's when you heard the statement from Mr. Ellis that he couldn't breathe.
Yes.
And you heard that from your house, is that right?
Yes.
And were you inside the house? Or
Outside the house. On the front porch.
You were on the front porch when you heard it?
Yes.
You asked some questions about CPR and the police. Do you recall, did the officers perform CPR before the fire department arrived? Is that what you said on direct?
Yes.
They were already doing CPR before fire arrived?
What it looked like to be, yes.
Okay. And did you stay outside that whole time?
Not the whole time. I walked in and out.
I think you were also asked back in, let me strike that. Just taking a look at my notes real quick here. Back it up just a moment.
Sure.
All right, that's all I have. Thank you, Mr. White.
Comments?
Just a few questions, Erwin.
Mr. Evans?
Mr. White, good afternoon. A few questions for you. Correct me if I'm wrong, but previously you described Mr. Ellis bucking the police officers while with him. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Does that sound accurate?
Yes.
Is that what you witnessed?
Yes.
And you also said that in your observations of the officer, you didn't see anything that you felt was excessive force. Is that right?
Not from the point that I had started to see what was happening.
Right. And we understand you had a limited period of time that you were watching, correct?
Yes.
But during that time, you never saw anything that you thought was excessive force.
At that time, yeah.
And at one point, you actually described or stated that you could physically see the 2 officers being manhandled by the man who was underneath them. Do you recall saying that?
That would be the bucking situation.
Okay, so you described the bucking as essentially Mr. Ellis, who had 2 police officers on top of him, manhandling the officer. Is that right?
Being able to move an officer that was on him. Yes.
So clearly exhibiting quite a bit of strength, fair to say?
Yes.
Okay. Could you tell that the officers were in their uniforms, but also had their duty vests on?
I could see the body plate that they had on them, on their vests.
And Ms. Eeks asked you a little bit about when you saw Mr. Ellis actually be placed into handcuffs. You remember her asking you about that?
Yes.
All right. Now, do you remember previously telling, I believe it was the detectives who interviewed you, that by the time I could physically see them restrained was by the time the third and the fourth officer arrived to the scene? You were saying that?
Yes.
So he wasn't restrained until the third and fourth officer had arrived, is that right?
At that point, yes.
Okay. And you went on to say, in the same interview, just the next sentence, that you didn't believe he was fully restrained until there were 12 squad cars there. You remember saying that?
I would have to look at it
Yeah,
again.
and
but
that's okay. If you don't mind taking a look at your interview, I believe it's exhibit 829 there. Do you have that?
What page?
So it's exhibit 829 on page 11 of 15 at the top. So it's essentially it starts with your answer, and then the detective says, okay, and then it's your next answer. You see that?
Yeah, by the time I was able to see that the restraints are on him, was by the time those 12 cop cars had already shown up and stuff.
Okay, so,
You just gotta keep your voice.
yeah.
Sorry.
You might repeat that for me.
By the time I actually saw the restraints on him, it was when the police officers had arrived with all the other cars.
So there were a number of police cars present when you saw that Mr. Ellis was actually fully restrained.
Yes.
correct? And that was because he kept fighting all the way.
I'm not gonna object. This is a meeting.
That is leading.
Did it appear that he wasn't restrained because he had been resisting up until that point?
He had it's when I had physically been able to tell that he had been restrained at that point. Not that it had been locked up before or after. It's just that's when I could tell that he had been completely restrained.
When all those officers were present?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Dudley Burton.
Ms. Brimmer.
Thank you. It's all right if I question Your Honor. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Samantha Redner, and I represent, along with Mr. Conrad, Officer Rankin. I represent you. He was one of the responding officers, the first two. Do you recognize him sitting next to me here today?
If you showed me either one of the police officers, I would not have been
I
able
wouldn't
to
expect you to.
recognize them.
Do you remember anything about those two responding officers? Did you see them do anything wrong?
Not at that.
Excessive.
Not at the point that I had seen them.
Sorry?
Not at the point that I had seen them.
Did you ever see him do anything inappropriate or excessive?
No, I did not.
No, you didn't. Okay. Your sister's Ayana, is that right?
Yes.
And you lived in the house with your wife, Ayana, and Ayana's fiance, and also your parents, is that right?
Yes.
Okay. Did you discuss what you saw with Ayana?
Not really.
Is there any picture of you, if you know, on the Vivint video? Did you look at and see yourself out on the porch at any point?
You can see me walk past the camera a few times.
You first went to the alarm itself to ascertain how the incident started, is that right?
Yes.
And you couldn't see, when you did that, how it started, is that right?
No, I could not.
When you were asked about a statement about the officers being manhandled, and I just wanted to ask if you remember from your statement that you said in describing that, so being able to lift up
I'm
to...
gonna object. This is, again, it's meeting.
I can ask it a different way, Your Honor.
Restate your question.
Thank you. How did you describe the lifting up of two officers?
Bucking is how I described it.
And what do you mean by bucking?
Physically being able to move a police officer
Could you
from
kind of
his
show
stance that was
Jerry,
on top,
Could you kind of just show us like bucking, like with his body?
like pushing off the ground.
Thank you. And you talked about the officers having body armor on while they were being pushed off the ground.
Yes.
Finally, were you contacted by the prosecutors or the attorney generals in this case?
I was contacted about 3 weeks ago, maybe about a month.
And were you asked to testify on behalf of the state?
They wanted to have an interview at that point.
And after the interview, did they tell you they
I
wanted?
did not have an interview with them.
I'm sorry.
I did not have an interview with them. I was trying to make sure to get work, take care of work, pay the bills.
So did you ever have any formal interview with the attorney general's office
I did
since
not.
2020?
I did not.
And were you summoned here in court by the defense
Yes,
and not the state?
not the same.
Thank you. Oh, no, one more thing. This interview that you gave with the Pierce County Sheriff's Department, you consented to that within a few months of the incident. Is that right?
Yes.
Thank you. That's all I have.
There's just a few questions. Mr. White, just a couple of questions with respect to how you saw the officers when Mr. Ellis was on the ground. You said you saw the officers, one on his left side, correct?
Yes,
And you said the other one was straddling, but he was straddled back by his butt, correct?
yes.
All right, so he wasn't on his torso. He was down below.
Midsection of his body.
Right. And then also with respect to hearing Mr. Ellis say he couldn't breathe, you actually only heard that one time, correct?
Only once.
So you heard it one time after he'd been tased a couple of times and after responding officers had shown up as well.
Yes.
And throughout the period of time that when Mr. Ellis, you observed this struggle, Mr. Ellis was attempting to get away from these officers, correct?
Yes.
He was moving his arms, he was bucking the officers off of him.
I'm not objecting to this meeting.
Let me rephrase.
It is leading.
At any point in time, did you see Mr. Ellis comply with the officer saying, quit resisting?
No oral statement was made.
You didn't
No.
hear the officer say that?
No, from the person, from Mr. Ellis.
You never heard him say anything to the officer acknowledging what they were asking him to do?
No, I did not.
Did he continue to fight throughout that period of time you watched him?
An objection leading.
Up until the tasers.
Okay, and then when you said it took four, you thought you heard four separate tasers.
Yes.
And after the first taser occurred, Mr. Ellis started fighting again?
Objection leading.
Don't permit this, so no.
After the first two tasers, he was still resisting at that point.
And it took the third taser before they actually continued on the
Yes.
And that, the tasers, did they occur sometime after the struggle had already started?
After the struggles, yes.
Then he tried to buck him off of it?
Yes.
I think that's all.
So I just so we're clear, the bucking or manhandling that you described all occurred while Mr. Ellis was on the ground on his stomach, correct?
Yes.
Okay. You didn't see him get up, he was on the ground,
No, I did not.
and the officers were on his back.
Yes.
And you were asked about, a moment ago, about the tasers. Is it correct that after the third taser, Mr. Ellis was not struggling any longer, correct?
At that point, it would have been putting the handcuffs on, from what I could see.
Okay. And if you could take a look at your statement, you were asked some questions. You can take a look at the rest of the questions about the top of page 11. If you could take a look at the bottom of page 10. Do you recall being asked this question by the detective? And did it get to the point where you were ever able to see them actually get him restrained or get his hands in handcuffs? Do you see that? Did you see that?
Not until, yeah, I can see it.
Okay, and your answer was, I think by the time I could physically see them restrained is by the time the third and the fourth officer had arrived on the scene, correct?
Yes.
And then I think you were clarifying this before. The detective says, okay, and then you responded, and by then he was fully restrained, And then a little after that, I think, like 12 squad cars had already pulled up, and a little into that, they started speeding up. Is that right?
Yes.
That's what your answers were.
Yes.
Okay, just 1 second, Your Honor. That's all I have. Thank you, Mr. White.
Mr. Arbenz?
I'm sorry, no, further.
Ms. Bremner?
Nothing further, and thank you, sir.
Just a question. Mr. White, you said that you saw him, it restrained, you said after the third or fourth officer. Are you talking the third or fourth officer or the third and fourth car that arrived at the scene?
Each car after that would have been almost individual police officers getting out of it.
All right, so how many cars, at the time that you saw Mr. Ellis was restrained, the first point in time, how many police cars were present?
3 to 4.
3 or 4 cars?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
No further questions from the state.
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Okay. Mr. Ashford, White, you are excused. Thank you very much. Where are we with respect to witnesses? Have you got one? All right, we'll take our morning or afternoon recess for 15 minutes. Ladies and gentlemen, please do not discuss the case. Thank you.
And you see that in the Martinez case. And in the Martinez case, that's actually the defendant's expert was going to testify as to statements that were made. It was an arson case, I believe, and it was a expert that had to do with how the fire started, and had relied upon statements made by witnesses in formulating his opinion. And the court ultimately said those statements aren't coming in because those witnesses aren't testifying, and it would be confusing to the jury that you're going to bring in these substantive statements for impeachment or otherwise to explain the basis for their opinions, and then did not allow the statements in under 403.
But these were statements that the expert had relied upon?
Those were statements that he had relied upon.
Well, even statements he relied upon, they couldn't bring in.
Correct. Under 403, the court found this is going to be more prejudicial than probative, and it's going to be confusing to the jury as to how these statements are substantive or not substantive, and so ultimately found that the statements shouldn't come in. And then you have the Hamilton case, which is actually a Snohomish County case that a colleague of mine at the time did, and I remember sitting in the pews and watching the state cross-examine the defense's expert, and it was regarding certain medical records and statements that were made within medical records, and the expert had reviewed the records but not relied upon them, and the state then was trying to impeach him because he hadn't relied upon them, and it was done over the defense's objection. It was a life sentence because it was a third strike, and the court actually reversed it in that case and said that it was improper to attempt to impeach the expert in that regard because he indicated he hadn't relied upon them. I think in this case, I anticipate that I've given all the information in this case to our experts, which is a lot of information, but our medical experts don't draw particular facts out of the other witness officer statements. So to the extent that they relied upon them, that's just not the case. They reviewed them, but what's important to their determination is how he initially presents, what his medical history says.
You're talking about how Mr. Ellis presents?
Presents to Collins and Burbank, sweating, eyes wide, and then how he presents at the time that EMS arrived, and what the EKG data indicates as well, and the autopsy records and the medical records. What I anticipate the state trying to do is trying to get in, because they didn't call these officers, is they're going to pick and choose statements contained within those officers' interviews and attempt to impeach some of these experts with those statements, essentially a backdoor hearsay under 705 to try and get in information that they're picking and choosing out of interviews to present in front of the jury under the disguise that it's impeachment. But the argument that they make in response to my brief is, well, it would be impeachment, so it wouldn't be offered for the truth of the matter asserted. Well, if it's not being offered for the truth of the matter asserted, then why does it matter? What would be the relevance of the substantive information of what's being relayed by those officers? They could question them and say, well, you didn't rely upon the statement of so-and-so, is that what you're telling us, or that you reviewed it and didn't rely upon it? I mean, I think that to the extent that that would be the line of questioning, I mean, I think that might be appropriate, but if they didn't rely upon it, then they didn't. But to the extent that they're going to try and get in substantive information about what's contained in there, they would be offering that for the truth of the matter of what's stated within there. I think an example would be, well, it's not important to your determination that Officer Faranis said that that Mr. Ellis went quiet prior to being rolled into the recovery position or something to that effect. And again, they're offering that information for the truth of the matter asserted. That's why they're trying to impeach with it, and to then instruct the jury, well, the fact that counsel is asking those questions about what officers said is not being offered substantively, but only for impeachment, is then thoroughly confusing at that point. So, and more importantly, I think it's a confrontation issue. So it's being disguised as impeachment. It's substantive in nature. That's what makes it pertinent. That's why the state would ask questions about it. And ultimately, since that is the basis, it's a confrontation issue. When I'm sitting here thinking about this issue as well, is I'm starting to think about the fact that there is evidence in this case that the state has presented and also not offered certain witnesses. And I'm going to sit down and look at all the pieces of evidence, including dispatch records that they haven't called the dispatcher in now, Vivint videos, whether there's who produced them or who did certain materials. They had Grant Fredericks up here for 2 days talking about he authenticated certain things without bringing in the actual witnesses associated with those. And there may very well be confrontation issues with that as well. I need to run through the analysis and really think that through. But I think that, that may become an issue in this case as well. I have to look at it and determine whether it's testimonial in nature, whether it would be provided to incriminate, and I can certainly take that up at a later date. But it's been difficult from the defense's perspective because they noted 90 witnesses, and so you don't know who they're calling and who you can confront and who you can't. But I'm getting sidetracked a bit. I think in terms of what the officers' statements are in this case, they've clearly not called them, and they would be offering them for substantive purposes.
Well, the state offers two things about all that. One is that there could be a limited instruction with respect to impeachment evidence, that it's not substantive. And one is that we can't do this motion in the manner in which you're provided because we need the context of exactly what it is that the state's trying to do at any one particular time, and therefore it's better to reserve ruling on these things as they come up on a case-by-case basis. What do you say to those ideas?
I tend to agree that I don't think it's premature. I think that the discussion needs to be had now prior to them attempting to do it. And so I think this motion is raising the issue in order to help facilitate that discussion. But I do think that if the state intends on handling this that way, that there needs to be some offer of proof as to voir direing the expert outside the presence of the jury in order to determine whether they relied on certain statements, and if they did, to what extent those would actually come in, and why. Why would substantive evidence of those statements come in, or what would be the importance of impeaching on a certain statement made by that individual? Again, I can't imagine that you would try and impeach, let's say, a use of force person. You want to impeach them with what another non-testifying officer said. And that you would be offering that strictly for impeachment, not because of what they said is actually true or not. Because if it's true or if it's not true, then what is the substantive? What is the impeachment value? Am I making sense on that?
Well, yeah, I reformulated my mind in a slightly different way, which is that it's like asking a hypothetical question based upon facts that have not been proved. It's a little like that.
Yeah.
Does that catch the gist of what you're saying?
Yeah, I think so. I'm tempted to instruct our experts. Listen, this is what the evidence that's been in front of the jury. I think aside from the medical records that we have and the autopsy records, that's what the substantive information is, and that's what we should provide our expert opinion on.
Okay. Ms. Ekstrom Sticolato?
Your Honor, I think the court's correct in that this is premature. If the court wants to go through the analysis.
Well, I wasn't saying that was my position. I was saying that's your position. What does he think of it?
I do think it is premature. I think it's something to address on a witness-by-witness basis, and offer of proof at the time is a certainly acceptable means of doing it. I would note that we're in a little bit of a disadvantage because the state has requested numerous times from particularly Mr. Conrad a list of materials relied upon by his experts, and instead we just get a list of everything they provided him. And so it would be great. We'll just assume that the list of everything that they provided him is what they relied upon.
Sure.
So,
Although I suppose it may come up specifically in the direct examination of the witness. But
yeah. But with that, Your Honor, I mean,
this will require me to listen more carefully.
go. And I recognize the Hamilton case, the state has no intention of doing a cross-examination as the prosecution did in that case on the court. Had the opportunity at the time to read through it. It's not what we intend on doing. I do think that it does come into play when you're talking about defense says, well, how is it relevant if it's hearsay and it's for impeachment? It's relevant as to the credibility of the analysis that was done by the particular expert. For example, if you have a use of force expert that relies upon one particular officer's statement, on-scene officer's statement, but chooses to not rely upon another officer that was on scene at the same time because that's not favorable to their opinion, it can be open. It opens for a cross-examination of why they chose what they chose, and I think that is certainly fair game and it has been for defense. And
That's true. This kind of thing has come up in the examination and cross-examination of the state's witnesses so far, expert witnesses so far. I'm thinking,
Confrontation clause, obviously not, but the other aspects of it have.
yeah. Well, even now in retrospect, I'm getting from Mr. Conrad, well, maybe there was a confrontation issue way before that we didn't hear an argument about. But
I think once he takes a look at the case law and sees that the chain of custody and things of that nature, and witnesses of that nature are not what's considered a confrontation. Just as the court told Mr. Conrad early on in this trial that if the state didn't call Dr. Clark, there wouldn't be an issue on the confrontation, which is consistent with the analysis, because with Dr. Mitchell, he went through how he got there and his own analysis of it, and that's really what it comes down to, is the cross-examination on the credibility of that witness's determination, not on the statement that was being offered. But again, Your Honor, I think we're trying to, we're asking, our defense is asking the court to make a decision, a ruling right now, where you really don't have the specifics of how it's going to come up. And we all certainly recognize the importance of the confrontation clause, recognize the importance of the evidence rules, and I can tell the court we don't intend on violating those at all, and I think the best route to go is to do an offer of proof if there's a question on it.
well, Mr. Conrad, what if the expert is testifying about some aspect of what was provided in terms of an other responding officer's statement? By other responding, I mean other than the defendants here, but not all of it. So, see, I considered Officer Ford's statement, for instance, about this and this. Would it then be okay for the state to say, well, what about Officer Ford's statements about these other couple of things that you didn't mention?
I mean, I think that
It's not too big a problem since you're going to call Officer Ford, right? So you're going to have confrontation, but
sure.
assuming he wasn't called.
So, again, I think that it goes back to my statements about, well, what's the importance of what that officer stated, right? It's because they're trying to get it in because it's substantive in nature, the substantive value of it.
Well, yes and no. I mean, I'm sure that there is interest. There may have an interest in it there, but part of it has to do with juries do not have to credit the testimony of expert witnesses. They can choose to disregard the testimony of an expert witness, and they can choose to disregard their opinions. On the other hand, they could also choose to highly regard them or regard them in some part and not in other parts. And that's based upon their view of the experience, training, knowledge of the witness, the information they considered. and so on. So as an example, but this was one that is probably not the best example here, but an example is Mr. Ryan, for instance, said, well, if you credit the testimony of the civilian witnesses that the state has proffered, then it doesn't appear there was any good reason to stop Mr. Ellis and have a conversation with him. But if you credit the testimony of the officers, then, yeah, they did have a good reason, and they would have been probable cause. Right? So that's kind of a microcosm of the possible things there. Usually you don't see that within a given witness. When the witness is going, there's my opinion. Not that my opinion would be this if you believe that, or my opinion's this if you believe this other thing. And I don't know which you should believe. Right? But assuming these are the facts, this is the opinion about whatever the technical, medical, whatever merit is that the experts testified about. So doesn't that at least caution me to say, like other motions in limine, we haven't called this specifically that, but that's kind of what this is, that the court should maybe reserve a ruling until we see how it develops in the course of the testimony. And I may well agree with you at a particular point. And I may not agree with you at another point, as opposed to ruling in some larger, perhaps too broad a way. I thought I heard somebody say right, but I really don't want people's comments about my opinion, even when they affirm me.
No, I mean, I try to be academically honest. I do. And I think that that's fair.
Well, that's why I'm having this conversation, because I credit you with that.
And I think that's probably a fair approach to it. But I'm thinking that if the value is that an expert took certain statements into account but didn't take other statements into account, that is the value in the impeachment information, right? It's not the substantive nature of what they said.
No, it may show the bias of the witness, if you will, in terms of I'm picking and choosing the stuff that's useful for me and ignoring the stuff that's not useful for my opinion.
But
I mean, at some point, wasn't that at least an undertow with respect to Dr. Clark and this other information that was sort of extra the whole deal, that somehow that he had a reputation for doing just that? Now, it didn't come up in his testimony, because I'm not sure anybody tried to claim that had happened here at all, but that had been some complaint that somebody had made against him within that office at one point, and that would be a legitimate thing if it were true, because then how can you credit a particular opinion if they're picking and choosing their... I mean, I expect lawyers to do that in their advocacy to some extent, but they're not expert witnesses and they're providing facts, and we expressly tell the jurors that the statements, comments of the lawyers are going to help you to understand the evidence and apply the law, but they are not evidence.
I think I understand what the court's saying. But again, if the value of the fact that the expert took in, first of all, I wouldn't assume that our experts have relied upon everything that's been given to them, because I don't think they've reviewed everything that's been given to them, because it's been thousands of documents. But let's say, hypothetically, this Ford example, right, which is, say, the use of force expert took into account a statement made by Officer Ford with regard to the treatment of Mr. Ellis or what an officer did, but didn't take into account other statements within that. I mean, to me, that's the value of the impeachment information, is that they're picking and choosing what to take into account. To go that step further and then publish to the jury what the other statements are, the purpose of that is to get in those other statements for substantive evidence.
Well, that kind of happened here, again, picking on Mr. Ryan, and picking's the wrong word here, but using him as the example. Wasn't there, for instance, cross-examination with respect to reports made by the state trooper that he didn't particularly emphasize in what he was saying?
There was.
But he acknowledged he'd seen it, and
I still think that a limiting instruction needs to be made with that regard, and I think that we should include that within the jury information.
It's entirely possible we could give him a limited instruction like that, and if you give me one, and when the situation arises, I may well provide it to the jury.
Is the court still considering, would the court consider giving it at the end of the instruction as well, a broader based one in terms of experts that relied upon statements of witnesses that have testified and then they found the substance of the leader that are not considered, but
Well, that may be premature too, but generally, if we wind up giving an instruction like that during the course of the trial, we most often will give it in the final jury instructions as well. So, I don't want to necessarily be hamstrung to any particular ruling now about that, but I can tell you that in general, yes, I'm favorable to that idea. As I also think that's what the law requires of me.
well, in terms of the Trooper Jones, the statements that were made by Trooper Jones, I mean, again,
Well, I don't want to bog down on that, but I guess my point was is that here was an out-of-court statement that was made, that was, he was asked about, that it was not part of something he talked about, at least in terms of his direct examination, but it came up later.
and then
But then, of course, there's also the potential there, at least a distinguishing factor, that there's no confrontation clause implication about that generally because it's being raised by the defense, for one thing. So if they're doing it, presumably there's a waiver, if you will.
I think that's fair. But again, you have to think about, so the issue with Trooper Jones was the state then redirected Mr. Ryan on certain statements that Trooper Jones made in terms of what his observations were as to when Mr. Ellis was prone and when he left and fire had arrived and all this other information. Again, that's coming in as they're trying to get those statements in for substantive purposes, right?
Well, Judge Ashcraft points out to me that during a case that he was a lawyer in front of me once. He says, "You said this in this case," and I've always remembered it. He said to me, and of course I'm baffled. What could I possibly have said that it made an impression on? So there was an objection made as to it's prejudicial, and evidently I said against by Judge Ashcraft's opponent in the case, and I said something like, "Well, if it wasn't prejudicial, he wouldn't be offering it." The issue is whether it's unfairly prejudicial, and even Rule 403 that I've been heard it's more prejudicial than probative. Even that rule in reserves actually says more substantially prejudicial than probative. So it can be a little more prejudicial than probative and still come in.
I agree, and I think that it's the confusion associated with the notion that impeachment information about what an expert is relying upon goes to the credibility of that witness versus this is information that the jurors are now going to rely upon as substantive evidence as to when Trooper Jones was there, what he witnessed.
Well, that's why if you ask for the limiting instruction, if it's only being offered for impeachment and not for substantive purposes, we can give them that instruction.
I guess I see that some danger in that.
Well, I grant you that.
And I see also confrontation.
I grant you that too, because even though something is authorized by the rules of evidence with respect to hearsay, in a particular instance, it may nevertheless contravene the confrontation clause. And therefore, even though just reading the rule seems like it's admissible, it's in fact unconstitutional in that situation. That makes it awfully hard for people like me to make the right decision. But we try, and I'm aware of the problem, and that sometimes is helpful. That doesn't mean I'm flawless. And I'm getting a lot of Hosanna, hallelujahs of that, that's true. A lot of amens. Yeah, not perfect at all. Anyway, so I am going to reserve a ruling on this, and as I say, if you've got a proposed limiting instruction, we'll take a look at that, draft something, and we'll take a look at that, and we'll go from there as it comes out. Okay? All right. You're welcome. And I agree with you. It was useful to have the conversation. Did you want to say something?
Good, John.
Okay. Thank you. All right. Well, I guess we're at recess then until tomorrow. Oh, by the way, before we go, one quick question. So we talked about these three witnesses. Which of the defendants is calling Officer Ford?
Officer Rankin.
Okay, who's calling Dr. Stankus?
Officer Rankin.
Who's calling Dr. Reese?
Officer Rankin.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Your Honor, just real quick with that, since these are expert witnesses, and I believe defense intends on doing this and keeping the order as stated, that, you know,
What do you mean?
well, he said we'll maybe get to Dr. Reese at the end of the day, so we would plan on,
Oh, but you mean you want them to call them, are you really going to call them the order of Ford, Stankus, and Reese?
that's what I'm asking.
Yeah. Is that the plan? Is there any possibility of something else happening?
Checking my messages in terms, because I've asked Dr. Reese now to show up tomorrow. And so I think that he would go last. Unless there's some scheduling issue with him, I would have to go after 4.
There you go. Best we can do. All right, we're at recess. See you all tomorrow.